The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg by Mark Twain continued. He was feeling reasonably comfortable now, but there was still one other detail that kept pushing itself on his notice. Of course, he had done that service. That was settled. But what was that service? He must recall it. He would not go to sleep till he had recalled it. It would make his peace of mind perfect. And so he thought and thought. He thought of a dozen things, possible services, even probable services, but none of them seemed adequate. None of them seemed large enough. None of them seemed worth the money, worth the fortune Goodson had wished he could leave in his will, and besides, he couldn't remember having done them anyway. Now then, what kind of a service would it be that would make a man so inordinately grateful? The saving of his soul. That must be it. Yes, he could remember now how he once set himself the task of converting Goodson, and labored at it as much as he was going to say 3 months, but upon closer examination it shrunk to a month, and then to a week, then to a day, then to nothing. Yes, he remembered now, and with unwelcome vividness, that Goodson had told him to go to thunder and mind his own business. He wasn't hankering to follow Hadleyburg to heaven. So that solution was a failure. He hadn't saved Goodson's soul. Richards was discouraged. Then, after a little, came another idea. Had he saved Goodson's property? No, that wouldn't do. He hadn't any. His life? That is it, of course. Why, he might have thought of it before. This time he was on the right track, sure. His imagination mill was hard at work in a minute now. Thereafter, during a stretch of 2 exhausting hours, he was busy saving Goodson's life. He saved it in all kinds of difficult and perilous ways. In every case, he got it saved satisfactorily, up to a certain point. Then, just as he was beginning to get, persuaded that it had really happened, a troublesome detail would turn up, which made the whole thing impossible, as in the matter of drowning, for instance. In that case, he had swum out and tugged Goodson ashore in an unconscious state with a great crowd looking on and applauding. But when he had got it all thought out, and was just beginning to remember all about it, a whole swarm of disqualifying details arrived on the ground. The town would have known of the circumstance. Mary would have known of it. It would glare like a limelight in his own memory, instead of being an inconspicuous service which he had possibly rendered without knowing its full value. And at this point he remembered that he couldn't swim anyway. There was a point which he had been overlooking from the start. It had been to be a service which he had rendered possibly without knowing the full value of it. Why, really, that ought to be an easy hunt, much easier than those others, and sure enough, by and by he found it. Goodson, years and years ago, came near marrying a very sweet and pretty girl named Nancy Hewitt. And in some way or other, the match had been broken off. The girl died. Goodson remained a bachelor, and by became a soured one, and a frank despiser of the human species. Soon after the girl's death, the village found out, or thought it had found out, that she carried a spoonful of Negro blood in her veins. Richards worked out the details a good while, and at the end he thought he remembered things concerning them that must have gotten mislaid in his memory through long neglect. Now, we need to drop this bit where even a mulatto is considered black. Biracial, Even a carbo-egger, 3/4 black. 3/4 Negroid is, you're still should probably admit the white portion or whatever portion. Certainly the mesties, casties, poestes, testes. Some people, it was because back in the day they would say you're black if you had any Negro feature, which is, Negro is a Negroid. Negro just means black. But anyways. He seemed to dimly remember that it was he that found out about the Negro blood, that it was he that told the village, that the village told Goodson where they got it, and he thus saved Goodson from marrying the tainted girl. That's where the whole thing comes from. So people need to just stop it with that. Whatever ancestry you have doesn't taint you. Even if the person's of a bad reputation, that's them, not you. That he had done him this great service without knowing the full value of it, in fact, without knowing that he was doing it, but that Goodson knew the value of it, and what a narrow escape he had had, and so went to his grave grateful to his benefactor and wishing he had a fortune to leave him. It was all clear and simple now, and the more he went over it, the more luminous and certain it grew, and at last, when he nestled to sleep satisfied and happy, he remembered the whole thing, just as if it had been yesterday. In fact, he dimly remembered Goodson's telling him his gratitude once. Meantime, Mary had spent $6,000 on a new house for herself and a pair of slippers for her pastor, and then had fallen peacefully to rest. That same Saturday evening, the postman had delivered a letter to each of the other principal citizens, 19 letters in all. No two of the envelopes were alike, and no two of the superscriptions were in the same hand, but the letters inside were just like each other in every detail but one. They were exact copies of the letter received by Richards, handwriting and all. They were all signed by Stephenson, but in place of Richard's name, each receiver's own name appeared. I was raised in the church that before and after the Civil War, there was the teaching, not long after the Civil War, by the way, but there was a teaching that race mixing should be a death penalty crime. And, you know, I could, if I was in my temple room, I could probably get out the reference to the official church literature that actually lists that. I mean, they don't that church. No, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints no longer prints that, but yeah. All night long, 18 principal citizens did what their caste brother Richards was doing. At the same time, they put in their energies trying to remember what notable service it was that they had unconsciously done Barclay Goodson. In no case was it a holiday job. Still, they succeeded, and while they were at this work, which was difficult, their wives put in the night spending the money, which was easy. During that one night, the 19 wives spent an average of $7,000 each out of the $40,000 in the sack. $133,000 together. Next day, there was a surprise for Jack Halliday. He noticed that the faces of the 19 chief citizens and their wives bore that expression of peaceful and holy happiness again. He could not understand it. Neither was he about to invent any remarks about it that could damage it or disturb it. And so, it was his turn to be dissatisfied with life. His private guesses at the reasons for the happiness failed in all instances upon examination. When he met Miss Wilcox and noticed the placid ecstasy in her face, he said to himself, "Her cat has had kittens," and went and asked the cook. It was not so. The cook had detected the happiness, but did not know the cause. When Halliday found the duplicate ecstasy in the face of Shadbelly Bilson, village nickname, he was sure some neighbor of Bilson's had broken his leg, but his inquiry showed that this had not happened. The subdued ecstasy in Gregory Yates's face could mean but one thing. He was a mother-in-law short. It was another mistake. And Pinkerton, he has collected 10 cents that he thought he was going to lose. And so on and so on. In some cases, the guesses had to remain in doubt. In the others, they proved distinct errors. In the end, Halliday said to himself, "Anyway, it puts up that there's 19 Hadleyburg families temporarily in heaven. I don't know how it happened. I only know that Providence is off duty today." well, that's a figure of speech, but divine will isn't always in accord with what people like. An architect and builder from the next state had lately ventured to set up a small business in this unpromising village, and his sign had now been hanging out a week. Not a customer yet. He was a discouraged man, and sorry he had come. But his weather changed suddenly now, first one and then the other. Another chief citizen's wife said to him privately, "Come to my house Monday week, but say nothing about it for the present. We think of building." He got 11 invitations that day. That night he wrote his daughter and broke off her match with her student. He said she could marry. A mile higher than that, Pinkerton the banker and 2 or 3 other well-to-do men planned country seats, but waited. That kind don't count their chickens until they are hatched. The Wilsons devised a grand new thing, a fancy dress ball. They made no actual promises, but told all their acquaintanceship in confidence that they were thinking the matter over and thought they should give it, and if we do, you will be invited, of course. People were surprised and said one to the other, "Why, they are crazy. Those poor Wilsons, they can't afford it." Several among the 19 said privately to their husbands, "It is a good idea. We will keep still till their cheap thing is over. Then we give one that will make it sick." The days drifted along, and the bill of future squanderings rose higher and higher, wilder and wilder, more and more foolish and reckless. It began to look as if every member of the 19 would not only spend his whole $40,000 before receiving day, but actually be in debt by the time he got the money. In some cases, light-headed people did not stop with planning to spend. They really spent on credit. They bought land, mortgages, farms, speculative stocks, fine clothes, horses, and various other things, paid down the bonus, and made themselves liable for the rest at 10 days. Presently the sober second thought came, and Halliday noticed that a ghastly anxiety was beginning to show up in a good many faces. Again he was puzzled, and didn't know what to make of it. The Wilcox kittens aren't dead, for they weren't born. Nobody's broken a leg, and there's no shrinkage in mother-in-laws. Nothing has happened. It is an unsolvable mystery. There was another puzzled man, too. The Reverend Mr. Burgess. For days, wherever he went, people seemed to follow him or be watching out for him, and if he ever found himself in a retired spot, a member of the 19 would be sure to appear, thrust an envelope privately into his hand, whisper to be opened at the town hall Friday evening, and then vanish away like a guilty thing. He was expecting that there might be one claimant for the sack, doubtful. However, Goodson, being dead, never occurred to him that all this crowd might be claimants. When the great Friday came at last, he found that he had 19 envelopes. 3. The town hall had never looked finer. The platform at the end of it was backed by a showy draping of flags. At intervals long, along the walls, were festoons of flags. The gallery fronts were clothed in flags. The supporting columns were swathed in flags. All this was to impress the stranger, for he would be there in considerable force, and in a large degree he would be connected with the press. The house was full. The 412 fixed seats were occupied. Also the 64 extra chairs. The 412 fixed seats were occupied, and also the 68 extra chairs, which had been packed into the aisles. Sorry about that. People should really go up to people's doors and knock and all that. The 412 fixed seats were occupied. Also the 68 extra chairs, which had been packed into the aisles. The steps of the platform were occupied. Some distinguished strangers were given seats on the platform. At the horseshoe of tables, which fenced the front and sides of the platform, sat a strong force of special correspondents, who had come from everywhere. It was the best-dressed house the town had ever produced. There were some tolerably expensive toilets there, and in several cases the ladies who wore them had the look of being unfamiliar with that kind of clothes. At least the town thought they had that look. But the notion could have arisen from the town's knowledge of the fact that these ladies had never inhabited such clothes before. The gold sack stood on a little table at the front of the platform, where all the house could see it. The bulk of the house gazed at it with a burning interest, a mouth-watering interest, a wistful and pathetic interest. A minority of 19 couples gazed at it in tenderly, lovingly, proprietarily, and the male half of this minority kept saying over to themselves, moving little impromptu speeches of thankfulness for the audience's applause and congratulations, which they were presently going to get up and deliver. Yeah, if you ever have to expose your charity or your good deeds, just stop if this is what I'm, got to figure out my speech, and every now and then, one of these got a piece of paper out of his vest pocket and privately glanced at it to refresh his memory. Of course, there was a buzz of conversation going on. There always is. But at last, when the Reverend Mr. Burgess rose and laid his hand on the sack, he could hear his microbes gnaw. The place was so still. He related the curious history of the sack, and then went on to speak in warm terms of Hadleyburg's old and well-earned reputation for spotless honesty, and of the town's just pride in this reputation. Well, just pride? I don't know. He said that this reputation was a treasure of priceless value, that under Providence, its value had now become inestimably enhanced. For the recent episode had spread this fame far and wide, and thus had focused the eyes of the American world upon this village, and made its name for all time, as he hoped and believed, a synonym for commercial incorruptibility. And there was applause. Well, I mean, this is a fiction, but, and who is to be the guardian of this noble treasure? The community as a whole? No, the responsibility is individual, not communal. From this day forth, each and every one of you is, in his own person, its special guardian, and individually responsible for that. No harm shall come to it. Does each of you accept this great trust? Tumultuous assent. Tumultuous assent. Then, all is well. Transmit it to your children and to your children's children. Today, your purity is beyond reproach. See to it that it shall remain so. Today, there is not a person in your community who could be beguiled to touch a penny, not his own. See to it that you abide in this grace. The crowd responds, "We will, we will." This is not the place to make comparisons between ourselves and other communities, some of them ungracious towards us. They have their ways, we have ours. Let us be content. And then applause. I am done. Under my hand, my friends, rests a stranger's eloquent recognition of what we are. Through him, the world will always henceforth know that we are. We do not know who he is, but in your name I utter his gratitude and ask you to raise your voices in endorsement. Well, obviously, this making a point based around that is not going to hold on well, right? The house rose in a body and made the walls quake with the thunders of its thankfulness for the space of a long minute. Then it sat down, and Mr. Burgess took an envelope out of his pocket. The house held its breath while he slit the envelope open and took from it a slip of paper. He read its contents, slowly and impressively. The audience listening with tranced attention to this magic document, each of whose words stood for an ingot of gold. The remark which I made to the distressed stranger was this: "You are very far from being a bad man. Go and reform." Then he continued, "We shall know in a moment now whether the remark here quoted corresponds with the one concealed in the sack, and if that shall prove to be so, and it undoubtedly will, the sack of gold belongs to a fellow citizen who will henceforth stand before the nation as a symbol of the special virtue which has made our town famous throughout the land." Mr. Belson, the house had gotten itself all ready to burst into the proper tornado of applause, but instead of doing it, it seemed stricken with paralysis. There was a deep hush for a moment or two. Then a wave of whispered murmurs swept the place of about this tenor: "Belson! Oh, come, this is too thin." $20 to a stranger, or anybody, Bilson, tell it to the Marines. And now at this point, the house caught its breath all of a sudden, in a new access of astonishment, for it is discovered that whereas in one part of the hall Deacon Bilson was standing up with his head meekly bowed, in another part of it Lawyer Wilson was doing the same. There was a wondering silence now for a while. Everybody was puzzled, and 19 couples were surprised and indignant. Bilson and Wilson turned and stared at each other. Bilson asked bittingly, Why do you rise, Mr. Wilson? Because I have a right to. Perhaps you will be good enough to explain to the House why you rise. With great pleasure, because I wrote that paper. It is an impudent falsity. I wrote it myself. It was Burgess's turn to be paralyzed. He stood looking vacantly. At first, one of the men, and then the other, did not seem to know what to do. The House was stupefied. Lawyer Wilson spoke up now and said, I asked the chair to read the name signed to that paper. That brought the chair to itself, and it read out the name, John Wharton Bilson. There, shouted Bilson. What have you got to say for yourself now? And what kind of apology are you going to make to me and to this insulted House for the imposture which you have attempted to play here? No apologies are due, sir. And as for the rest of it, I publicly charge you with pilfering my note from Mr. Burgess and substituting a copy of it signed with your own name. There is no other way by which you could have gotten hold of the test remark. I alone of living men possess the secret of its wording. There was likely to be a scandalous state of things if this went on. Everybody noticed with distress that the short-handed scribes were scribbling like mad. Many people were crying, Chair, chair, order, order. Burgess rapped with his gavel and said, Let us not forget, the property's due. There has evidently been a mistake somewhere, but surely that is all. If Mr. Wilson gave me an envelope, and I remember now that he did, I still have it. He took one out of his pocket, opened it, glanced at it, looked surprised and worried, and stood silent for a few moments. Then he waved his hand in a wandering and mechanical way, and made an effort or two to say something, and then gave it up despondently. Several voices cried out, Read it, read it. What is it? So he began in a dazed and sleepwalker fashion. The remark which I made to the unhappy stranger was this. You are far from being a bad man. The House gazed at him marveling. Go and reform. And there were murmurs. Amazing. What can this mean? This one, said the chair, is signed Thurlow G. Wilson. There, cried Wilson. I reckon that settles it. I knew perfectly well my note was purloined. Purloined? Retorted Bilson. I'll let you know that neither you nor any man of your kidney must venture to. The chair said, Order, gentlemen, order. Take your seats, both of you, please. They obeyed, shaking their heads and grumbling angrily. The House was profoundly puzzled. It did not know what to do with this curious emergency. Presently, Thompson got up. Thompson was the hatter. He would have liked to be a 19er, but such was not for him. His stock of hats was not considerable enough for the position, he said. Mr. Chairman, if I may be permitted to make a suggestion, can both of these gentlemen be right? I put it to you, sir. Can both have happened to say that the very same word? Can both have happened to have said the same words to the stranger? It seems to me the tanner got up and interrupted him. The tanner was a disgruntled man. He believed himself entitled to be a 19er, but he could not get couldn't get recognition. It made him a little unpleasant in his ways and speech, said he. Sho, that's not the point. That could happen twice in 100 years, but not the other thing. Neither of them gave the $20. A ripple of applause. Bilson said, I did. Wilson said, I did. Then each accused the other of pilfering. The chair said, Order, sit down, if you please, both of you. Neither of the notes has been out of my possession at any moment. A voice said, Good, that settles that. The tanner said, Mr. Chairman, one thing is now plain. One of these men has been eavesdropping under the other one's bed and filching family secrets. If it is not unparliamentary to suggest it, I will remark that both are equal to it. The chair said, "Order, order." "I withdraw the remark, sir, and will confine myself to suggesting that if one of them has overheard the other revel the test remark to his wife, we shall catch him now." A voice said, "How?" The tanner said, "Easily. The two have not quoted the remark in exactly the same words. You would have noticed that if there hadn't been a considerable stretch of time and an exciting quarrel inserted between the two readings." A voice said, "Name the difference. The word very is in Wilson's note, and not in the other." Many voices, "That is so. He's right." And so if the chair will examine the test remark in the sack, we should know which of these two frauds. The chair said, "Order." Which of these two adventurers? The chair said, "Order, order." Of which these two gentlemen, laughter and applause, is entitled to wear the belt as being the first dishonest blatherskite ever bred in this town, which he has dishonored. And which will be a sultry place for him from now out. Vigorous applause. Many voices. "Open it. Open the sack." Mr. Burgess made a slit in the sack, slid his hand in, and brought out an envelope. In it were a couple of folded notes. He said, "One of these was marked, not to be examined until all written communications, which have been addressed to the chair, if any, shall have been read. The other is marked, the test. Allow me, it is worded to wit, I do not require that the first half of the remark, which was made to me by my benefactor, shall be quoted with exactness, for it was not striking and could be forgotten, but its closing 15 words are quite striking, and I think easily rememberable. Unless these shall be accurately reproduced, let the applicant be regarded as an impostor. My benefactor began by saying he seldom gave advice to anyone, but that it always bore the hallmark of high value when he did give it. Then he said this, and it has never faded from my memory: you are far from being a bad man. And so on. 50 voices said, that settles it. The money's Wilson's. Wilson, Wilson. Speech, speech. People jumped up and crowded around Wilson, wringing his hand and congratulating fervently. Meantime, the chair was hammering with the gavel, shouting, "Order, gentlemen, order, order. Let me finish reading, please." When quiet was restored, the reading was resumed as follows. "Go and reform, or, mark my words, some day, for your sins, you will die and go to hell, or, Hadleyburg. Try and make it the former." A ghastly silence followed. First, an angry cloud began to settle darkly upon the faces of the citizenship. After a pause, the cloud began to rise, and a tickled expression tried to take its place, tried so hard that it was only kept under. With great and painful difficulty, the reporters, the Brixtonites, and other strangers bent their heads down and shielded their faces with their hands, and managed to hold in by main strength and heroic courtesy. At this most inopportune time burst upon the stillness and roar of a solitary voice. Jack Halliday's. That's got the hallmark on it. Then the house let go, strangers and all. Even Mr. Burgess's gravity broke down presently, and the audience considered itself officially absolved from all restraint, and it made the most of its privilege. It was a good long laugh, and a tempestuously whole-hearted one, but it ceased at last, long enough for Mr. Burgess to try to resume, and for the people to get their eyes partially wiped. Then it broke out again, and afterward yet again. Then at last Burgess was able to get out these serious words. "It is useless to try to disguise the fact we find ourselves in the presence of a matter of grave import. It involves the honor of your town. It strikes at the town's good name. The difference of a single word between the test remarks offered by Mr. Wilson and Mr. Bilson was itself a serious thing, since it indicated that one or the other of these gentlemen had committed a theft. The two men were sitting limp, nervous, crushed. But at these words, both were electrified into movement, and started to get up. "Sit down," said the chair sharply, and they obeyed. That, as I have said, was a serious thing, and it was, but for only one of them. But the matter has become graver, for the honor of both is now in formidable peril. Shall I even go further and say in inexorable peril? Both left out the crucial 15 words. He paused. During several moments he allowed the pervading stillness to gather and deepen its impressive effects, then added, "There would seem to be but one way whereby this could happen. I ask these gentlemen, was there collusion? Agreement?" A low murmur sifted through the house. Its import was, "He's got them both." Bilson was not used to emergencies. He sat in a helpless collapse. But Wilson was a lawyer. He struggled to his feet, pale and worried, and said, "I ask the indulgence of the House while I explain this most painful matter. I'm sorry to say what I'm about to say, since it must inflict irreparable injury upon Mr. Bilson, whom I have always esteemed and respected until now, and in whose invulnerability to temptation I entirely believed, as did you all. But for the preservation of my own honor I must speak, and with frankness. I confess with shame, and I now beseech your pardon for it, that I said to the ruined stranger all of the words contained in the test remark, including the disparaging 15. Sensation. When the late publication was made, I recalled them. I resolved to claim the sack of coin, for by every right I was entitled to it. Now I will ask you to consider this point, and weigh it well. That stranger's gratitude to me that night knew no bounds. He said himself that he could find no words for it that were adequate, and that if he should ever be able, he would repay me 1,000-fold. Now then, I ask you this. Could I expect, could I believe, could I even remotely imagine that feeling as he did, he would do so ungrateful a thing as to add those quite unnecessary 15 words to his test, set a trap for me, expose me as a slanderer of my own town before my own people assembled in a public hall? It was preposterous, it was impossible. This test would contain only the kindly opening clause of my remark. Of that I had no shadow of a doubt. You would have thought as I did. You would not have expected a base betrayal from one you had befriended and against whom you had committed no offense. And so, with perfect confidence, perfect trust, I wrote a piece of paper to the opening words, the opening words ending with "go" and "reform," and signed it. And, well, it's not the joke to make, but,